Channel 10.
Yo. Once again, it's the Channel 10 podcast. The almighty AR alongside
Singer Superior.
And today we have a very special episode with Shawn Setaro. Shawn Setaro has one of the top hip-hop podcasts, the Cipher. And he's also involved in numerous other things, including being a contributor to Forbes magazine. He's also written for The Atlantic. He's also written for Vibe. He's also written for so many other publications. And we got the opportunity to speak with him on a variety of subjects dealing with hip-hop. And this was definitely a great episode, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would, man. I would.
So, what are your takeaways from the episode?
Oh man, first of all, yeah, I really appreciate, Shawn coming on, and as we've had, we've had a correspondence with him, in the past with certain episodes that we've had on the podcast, but just like his advice on podcasting, especially when it comes to Skype. For the listeners out there, you guys will know that, we do deal with a lot of crosstalk with a lot of our guests because we can't see them oftentimes. And also just like the background, making that transition from being a musician to a journalist, making that transition from, having that backing with his podcast and in the earlier stages, and then making it into what it is today from outside the lines to the Cipher. So I just think that this episode, like maybe one of the main ideas of this episode is transitioning, which is it's a big part of Shawn's story, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, starting off, I guess if you were to start from his experience going to school at Berklee, and playing guitar and bass in various bands, and he's even gone on tour, and it's like the way that his career path has gone into realms that he never would have realized is pretty dope to me, and it's definitely something to think about in life. Me being a little bit older, and being involved in music, and then also being involved in podcasting and various things. It's interesting to see how somebody else's career path has taken various changes that they may not have foreseen. So this is definitely a great conversation. I definitely think that you should stick around and check it out.
Yeah.
And of course, today's podcast is brought to you by Audible, where you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com. Let me just say that again more slowly for some of you, because some of y'all listen slow because I speak fast. audibletrial.com/channel10, where you can get over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, your Android, your Kindle, your MP3 player, whatever you listen to it on. You can subscribe to Audible, get your 30-day free trial, and listen to great authors such as Michelle Alexander and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and you can listen to the Harry Potter series. You can listen to The Martian. These are all like great books that I've listened to through Audible. And I have an Audible subscription, and I definitely don't regret it. And I don't think you will as well. So, I strongly suggest you check it out. Audiobooks have definitely enriched my life, and are going to my goal of listening to 100 books in a year. So, yeah. Also, you can support the podcast through patreon.com/channel10podcast. That's patreon.com/channel, the number 10, and the word podcast. And by going to that URL, you can pledge a certain amount of money per episode, whether it be $1, whether it be 100, whether it be 1,000, whether it be 1,000,000. And that will help us with costs of web hosting, with website design, with various other promotional things that go into creating a podcast and keep delivering you great content such as this episode with Shawn Setaro. So, we definitely appreciate you if you go to patreon.com/channel10podcast, and if you go ahead and donate, we will shout you out on the show, and we will provide your Twitter, your Instagram, whatever URL you want to provide. We will help you out a little bit.
I mean, you know what? And you know what? I mean, maybe even possibly have a conversation with them.
You might even have a conversation with you. So go ahead and go to patreon.com/channel10podcast and pledge per episode, and you never know what can happen. And I think at this point that's it. So we can go ahead and start the show.
All right.
Let's go.
Like CNN Channel 10. And we used to think that people would catch on. But if you're not from Queens, if you don't got Time Warner or whatever, like, well, I didn't know that.
Do it, yo. Yo, word up, man. It's a different channel, son. Word up, on, man. Word up, watch the channel, son. Different plane now, man. It's all good. Word up, all good, baby, in every hood, son. Word up, yo. CNN, Network, Channel 10. It's on again. Street niggas, it's grown men. Bold face, get in your face. Stay in place, yo, crime lace. Cast more beef than Scarface. CNN, Network, Channel 10. It's on again. Street niggas, that's grown men. Bold face, get in your face. Stay in place, yo, crime lace. Cast more beef than Scarface.
Yo.
We're back once again. It's the Channel 10 podcast, and it's me, AR Tick in the building, and I'm alongside
Singer Superior.
And today we have a very, very special guest in the building with us. We have the host of one of the top podcasts in the hip hop world, and he also, has a pretty diverse career in music and hip hop and journalism. We have Shawn Setaro. How's it going, Shawn?
Hey, how are you guys? And you pronounced the last name right. Not even people who've known me for years do that.
Yeah. Where's your last name from?
It's Italian. My dad's side is Italian.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember. I think it was Don Will. He made some kind of comparison to your last name in Serato, I think.
yeah, he did. Yeah, he always, he always jokes that that's going to be my DJ name.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I did that too at first. So where are you from originally?
I am originally from a tiny town called East Windsor in New Jersey. It's kind of very near Princeton, kind of equidistant between New York and Philadelphia.
Okay. And what was it like growing up there?
I think like anyone else growing up, you just kind of think it's normal because you don't know anything different. Very suburban. I guess you could say like it was very odd in that the small community within the town I lived in was one of the first like planned communities in the United States, and I think is maybe still one of the largest. So just, the only thing that made that stick out, aside from the very strict restrictions on colors you could paint your house and stuff, was the fact that it was largely like expat Brooklyn Jews, like people who had left New York City to, start a family and move to the, I guess even though it was like over an hour away, it still kind of counted as the suburbs of New York City. So, very somewhat anomalous in that respect. But no, it was great. It was great growing up there.
And what were some of your early influences in music? What type of music were your parents playing around the house if they did?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. My dad especially was always like singing around the house and stuff. He was, he was born in 1944, so he was a very big Elvis guy. Elvis kind of hit at his, sweet spot in terms of age. But he also loved, the Beatles and the Stones, and definitely had a soft spot for country music as well. I think those were, and there were some, as I got older and sort of started rifling through my folks' vinyl collections, there were some odds and ends there that were surprising to me as well, definitely.
Now, did your father ever play, or your mother, play the Beach Boys around the house at all?
Yes, they did, actually. And in fact, the Beach Boys was probably my first concert that they took me to when I was very, very young.
Really?
We definitely had the Endless Summer, that greatest hits, which I now have in my house that I sort of have on permanent loan from them. So I certainly knew that stuff pretty well. It wasn't until later, my sort of teenage years, that I got into their crazier, Pet Sounds and beyond sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, I never hear too many people ever say that their parents, play the Beach Boys, in their household, and so I'm trying to figure out, since people write about them so much, like, who the hell's listening to them?
Yeah, we definitely had the greatest hits, but that's heavy on the sort of early surf stuff, the kind of like, Chuck Berry ripoff era of the group.
Yeah.
Are you a Beach Boys or a Beatles person?
Oh, you read my mind.
Wow. I think it depends on, I love them both. I think it depends on the phase you catch me in. I've definitely gone through multiple phases of both groups. I would have to say, I think probably, gun to my head, as much as I hate that phrase, I would have to say the Beatles, just for kind of like the depth of their catalog overall, and just the fact that they did so many things first. I remember, you can stop me if this gets too boring, but I remember hearing a lecture from Will Lee, who is a world-class session bass player who also plays in a Beatles cover band. And he sort of broke down all the things the Beatles did first. And it was, the obvious things you might think of: first band to play in a stadium, and then, things you might not think of, first band to use, feedback on a record, and, all this kind of stuff. So the amount of stuff that they innovated is just staggering.
Well, I am a pretty big Beach Boys fan, and actually, some days ago, me and Artic, we had a conversation about the many versions of and reconstructions of Smile that we had between each other, and I think the way that I always kind of try to explain to other people is that I say that that the Beatles made great songs, the Beach Boys made great albums.
Okay, I can see that. I mean, the thing about Smile that's so interesting is, like, I don't think there'll ever be a definitive version. I mean, I can hardly in some ways bring myself to listen to the version Brian Wilson redid, because it was just made in a different time, in a different headspace. It's not definitive, no matter, I think, how much you would like it to be.
Yeah,
it's almost like the Life of Pablo.
Exactly. Life of Pablo may be our modern day Smile, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just never finished, always being tweaked, and maybe abandoned. And in 2040, Kanye will come out with what he will call re-record it in its entirety.
Yeah.
Let's call it here. Hoping for the 2040 version Life of Pablo is going to be great.
Yeah. So, what was your first introduction into being involved in music?
Wow, I think, just as a kid, I was just, singing in, little grammar school choruses and plays and things like that, always. But really, when I guess it was the summer before 6th grade, I started playing guitar, and that was, and I think that would be kind of the real introduction when I sort of really started getting deeply involved.
And you play bass as well?
Yeah, I play bass. I play that more than guitar. You know, at some point along my journey, I kind of flipped from being a guitarist who could double on bass to the other way around.
Mhm.
Okay.
So, and you started playing in bands, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, growing up, I was in lots of different bands among friends, and then once I got to college, I went to a music school, went to Berklee College of Music in Boston, and while I was in Boston, got very heavily involved in the rock scene over there, and then moved to New York and started playing in bands and touring and doing session work and all of that kind of stuff that musicians have to do to make a living.
Mm. So when you went to college at Berkeley, were there any notable people in that program during the time?
You know, there probably were, and I'm just forgetting. I know that, uh, John Mayer, I think, was there shortly after me. And yeah, there were probably a few other people as well. I know that Paula Cole, who at the time I was there had giant hits, was there right before me because they wouldn't stop talking about her.
Mhm.
So, there were a few people here and there. I'm sure I'm doing the school a disservice by not having the alums of my era there at the ready.
Hmm. Okay, and I remember I think going back to the 100th episode of the Cipher where Don Will interviews you briefly. You mentioned like really falling in love with NWA. So I'm assuming that when you got to Berkeley, we're talking like mid '90s,
Yeah, I was there
possibly, or
to date myself. Yeah, 1995 to 98, I was there. Yeah.
okay. And so you got really heavily involved in the rock scene there, and so I'm assuming that you probably frequented the channel quite a bit.
The channel died just before I got to town.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, people I knew talked about it fondly, but it was by the time I started going to clubs and stuff, that place was dead. I was kind of there for the last legs of the rat, but when I was there, it was definitely like the Middle East and TTs were kind of ruling the roost as far as clubs of that size.
Mm. Well, and so what was the hip hop scene like in that area during the time?
Well, the hip hop scene was, a lot of shows I remember being at, primarily the Middle East downstairs, which is maybe like a 500 person venue in Cambridge. That was huge. There were a lot of shows there, and that in various places in Boston on Lansdowne Street. It seemed like shows were sort of trying to find a home. I remember they would have the annual Super Bowl Sunday freestyle contest every year that came to be a huge deal. And a lot of the shows I remember going to were a lot of the, at that point, underground kind of Def Jux shows and things like that. I remember seeing Mr. Liff, probably a dozen times over the years I was there. Things like that.
What about 7L and Esoteric?
Yeah, absolutely. They were around definitely on a lot of the bills that I saw back then.
Did you ever try your hand at rapping?
Oh no. Oh no. I joke only somewhat in jest that the world doesn't need another white rapper. But also no, in fact it's funny in some ways that I ended up where I did, in that I started really, really getting into hip hop when I was going to music school, and so much other music became, how are they doing that? Can I do that? What are they doing? And trying to analyze it deeply. And so rap to me was always the music that I didn't have to be concerned about how are they doing that. I could just listen for enjoyment because the idea of making it, never entered my mind. Little did I know I would later find a job analyzing hip hop, of course,
Right.
the way the world works sometimes, I guess.
Do you feel that attending music school and the way that they train your ear, that it takes away from the enjoyment of music sometimes? Because, I went to school for audio, and, the way that, they train you to listen for compression and like how the mics are are during certain recordings and everything. Sometimes it makes you listen to things in more of a technical way.
Sure, I hear that. In general, I haven't had that much of a problem with it. I feel like obviously I do hear certain things in terms of like, harmony and textures and things, but in general, that tends to add to my enjoyment rather than take away from it, at least for me.
Okay. And at this time, what were your aspirations? Were you trying to be like in a big rock band, or did you see your career path taking the path that it took?
I definitely did not see it taking the path that it took. I can tell you that much. No, for a long time, I played in rock bands, and I would find projects that I was passionate about and try to pursue them to the end until they dissolve in some way or another. So I definitely envision myself, being in a band. I don't know about like a star or whatever, but just kind of being in a band that would, make a living and tour and, be able to be sustainable that way. I mean, that as I'm sure you guys know is even that level of success is extremely, extremely difficult to get and even more difficult to sustain.
Yeah. How did you, I guess after college, you started doing session work?
Yeah, there was definitely some of that. That really came up more when I moved to New York City, which happened in like 2004. Yeah, there was just, it's something that, you meet people and they need, stuff played on albums or, for gigs and things like that. And you end up doing it and you find yourself in all kinds of crazy situations. I've done all sorts of gigs, maybe post interview, I'll tell you some stories so as to protect the innocent and the not so innocent. But yeah, you end up doing, all kinds of stuff. I mean, ended up playing, everything from, folk to rap rock and emo, and everywhere in between. So, yeah.
And so, one of the main bands that you were a part of, in Boston, I believe, is, Helicopter, right?
Yeah. Wow, you guys really did do your homework. Yeah. That was a group that, of all the bands I played with, was possibly the longest term and definitely kind of did the most touring and stuff like that. Yeah, absolutely.
And that was, and that was before God Boy?
No, wow, geez, you really did go back. That was after, just after. Jesus. Yeah. That was just after. And that was, and in Helicopter was the first, project that I played bass in. Like before I joined, I ran into their bass player, like at a bus station in New York City. And he said, "Hey, I'm moving to New York." And a little light bulb went off and I said, "Okay, hey, I think I can do that." And, ended up getting the spot.
Okay. And then, so with Helicopter, you guys toured like all throughout the East Coast and especially doing like a lot of local, venues in Boston.
We did a lot of stuff in Boston. We did a lot of touring throughout the U.S. Like we did the Midwest, Southwest, the West Coast, just kind of, that was my real introduction to life on the road was with that group.
And so how was that?
It was
touring and everything like that.
It was great. I did that for a long time with a bunch of different acts, and I loved life on the road. I loved the pace of it. I loved a lot about the rhythm of it. As it got toward the end of my time doing it, I did not love how much you end up drinking on the road. This is a dynamic. If you listen to the Cipher, you notice I talk about this sometime with artists who tour a lot. Your life becomes a perpetual party in a way that's often unhealthy because you arrive in town and people have been waiting, sometimes weeks or months for you to show up. They have the next day off from work. It's a party for them, but it's your job.
Right. I just listened to your episode with the Grouch and Eli, and they were talking about the trappings of alcohol on tour, and I thought it was pretty poignant. I think it was I forget which one said it, but basically, um, you know, drinking until stumbling, and then spending the next day trying to recover to do it all again for days in a row.
Yeah, they didn't make that sound very fun. Yeah, but I know it. I mean, it's you don't see it until you are home,
Mm.
and then you start thinking. I remember myself thinking like, oh yeah, normal night. I'll have no more than 3 beers before we play, and then one on stage, and then after then no more than on a light night it's 2 or 3 after the show, and by the time you add them all up, you're like, what, how much was I drinking every day? It'll sneak up on you like that.
Mm. Wow, that's crazy. Do
Mm-hmm.
you still drink from time to time, or?
Occasionally, but it is cut down very, very significantly from those days.
So after the tour life, what was next for you?
Well, in the middle of all of that,
Mm.
Rap Genius kind of came up.
Mm.
I was not touring as much as I was teaching at that point, teaching and doing session work and kind of getting settled in New York City. And, Rap Genius kind of came up, and I did that. Initially it was a hobby that seemed to take up every waking moment for a while. And then it became a part-time job in, not that much time in the scheme of things. And then eventually for a while, a full-time job.
And this is when, and so you stumbled across Rap Genius around the time when you were making annotated notes of Jay-Z lyrics for your girlfriend?
That was, that was actually a little bit before, but yes,
Okay.
that was, my partner and I, we met in 2004, not long after I moved to New York. And this was like relatively early on in the process of getting to know each other. I had a day job on what a friend of mine used to call the free cell circuit.
Yeah.
Basically, you sit around and play Microsoft games all day and try not to get caught. And so I had plenty of free time, and we, were talking about hip hop and talking about Jay, and I did that story that I recounted in the interview with Don Will. And and then I stumbled across a website, a few years later that did literally the same thing, and it felt like, someone took my brain and put it on a computer.
Mm. Now, did you get involved before or after the big investment that Rap Genius received?
Well before. When I started, it was literally just the founders and people they knew in college. I was the first person they didn't know personally to get involved with the site.
Are they cool people? How was it working with them?
I mean, in the early days, I wouldn't, despite, living in New York, I wouldn't see them in person that much. We would get together for, the occasional party or birthday celebration or, occasional meeting, things like that. But it was very much like working remote, but communicating, all the time via email.
Mm. And, when it became a full-time job, that's when your podcast first started, correct?
Yeah, it was right around then. It was, those sort of started around the same time. I would have to kind of go back and check the calendar to see which came first. But yeah, the podcast came in 2012, which is, right around that time. And that was kind of a supplement to the other work I was doing at Rap Genius. I thought it was like, a way to talk to people I wanted to talk to within the mission of the site, which was, talking about their work, but do something beyond breaking stuff down line by line. Although I should be perfectly clear that mission was somewhat accidental. How it started was, I just had a conversation that was originally going to be broken down line by line, but the whole thing proved really compelling. And so, ended up making a podcast out of this entire conversation, which was never the original intent.
Mm. And was that with Jean Grey?
That was with Gene, yeah.
Okay. And I guess as it progressed, I guess you never probably thought that you would ever be doing a podcast. Were you into podcasts before that?
No, in fact, I had to ask one of my more tech savvy friends, Arthur, if you're listening, thanks, for, the most basic tips on like how, I mean, I knew what they were, but, so the most basic tips on like how to do it, how to get set up, what company to go with. I had no idea of the ins and outs of it. I mean, I had listened to tons of radio, so I knew like, oh, it's like a radio show. And, my template was basically like, was basically like was like an interview based, radio show, public radio show, basically.
Mm-hmm. And then also your producer, Josh Cross, he also had experience with different podcast projects, right?
Yeah, Josh came on, very, very early in the process. Not the very first episode, but not that long thereafter. And yeah, he had recorded music for a long time, as a musician and stuff, and then also got involved in podcasting. He has a podcast that he produces. He is a stay-at-home father, so he has a show called Modern Dads, a Modern Dads podcast that he produces and he has been working on for a long time. And so he had experience, doing that. And so it seemed like, this is someone I grew up with, someone I've known, years and years. And he very quickly became, about as invested in the project as I am.
And I must ask this question. What's up with the Hamlet themed cover of Walk on the Wild Side?
Oh man, you're checking the dark web here. Yeah, no, that was, Josh mentioned that on the bio as a joke. That was, it's true though. I mean, that was something we did in a high school English class. I forget what the actual assignment was, but somehow we turned, make something about Hamlet into that.
I mean, well, I guess I can kind of see that with Walk on the Wild Side, the lyrics and all, but yeah, it's one of my favorite songs, so I was pretty curious about that.
Yeah, I'm sure we rewrote the lyrics very poorly.
So, I guess during your podcast journey, have you been able to develop relationships with any of the artists who you've interviewed?
Yes, absolutely. Both, the artists and some of the other people as well who aren't artists, but, play other roles. Absolutely. Some of them not, with a lot of them, they come in and do the interview and I will, interact with them periodically and it's friendly, but there are a few who have become like friends in IRL, I guess, for lack of a better term. Absolutely, yeah.
And, from your first episodes up until now, what would you say are some of like the tips and tricks that you've learned throughout your podcast journey?
Wow, that is a great question. I think, as silly as it sounds, one thing I've learned is that if something is interesting to me, it is likely to be interesting to other people. My method, such as it is to prepare for an interview, is just ingest a lot of stuff and see what of all of that sticks out for me. It's, it may sound selfish or whatever, but I've found that it leads to good interviews, is to just kind of go through a mass of things that the subject has been involved in, whatever it is, songs they've done, books they've written, interviews they've given, and just, I don't even really have a word for what it is, but find, something interesting that sticks out and kind of go from there. The other thing is, stay close to the microphone.
Now, when you have guests, are you always familiar with them, or sometimes is it just like, you're completely learning about everything that they've done for the first time?
Oh, you're saying after I decide to have them on the show?
Right,
like
right.
Before, okay. It is, it's a mix. Oftentimes I'll know about them, or know of them, or, have at least some knowledge of what they do and who they are. but, often, almost every time in researching a show, I learned something, whether it's, listening to someone's whole catalog when I was only familiar maybe with their name or with a few guest appearances, or, finding out the hidden juvenilia of, someone like Fonte or something, where I knew a lot of his work, but didn't know, the hidden secret album he did in 2000 before anyone knew him.
Yeah, that was crazy. I'm have to go check that out.
I would say probably one of my most favorite interviews, episodes on the Cipher was the Jake One episode, and it's so in depth about the culture, the hip hop culture of I believe Ohio and stuff like that, and I'm just curious to know, like, how long did it take you to prepare for that interview, or did you just kind of like know certain things just from just reading in general?
I mean, I knew some stuff of Jake One's, a lot of the Rhymestayer stuff, but no, I just kind of like, I don't know if I could say an exact number of hours, but I prepared for it until I ran out of time, basically. I prepared for it until the day before, when I finally had to sit down and go through my 25 pages of notes and turn them into questions somehow. But yeah, that one in particular, because his discography was so broad, I really, with producers, I will try really hard to go through, as close to everything they've done as I can, time permitting. And with him, especially some of the early stuff, I found that super interesting because I wasn't familiar with a lot of the stuff he had done, early on in Seattle or whatever. So it was, it was good to go back and hear that and say, well, how does that relate to what he would do later, and how did he grow stylistically?
Mm-hmm. What are some of your favorite interviews that you've done?
People always ask this, and I should have some stock answer ready, but there are so many that have been really incredible moments. I think, the very first one with Jean Grey stands out because of its unexpected nature. I was a huge fan. I'd never met her. I didn't know what to expect. And the fact that the conversation was so great, and the fact that she seemed so grateful to be asked questions about her work, really showed me that I was onto something, and that made that episode really special. I always mention the one with Abiodun Oyewole of The Last Poets, just because that one was just so epic. It was 50 years of history, just going through everything from, him moving to Harlem and starting The Last Poets to, getting arrested and spending time in prison, just all sorts of crazy stuff, and kind of his take on various movements in basically black art and music, from someone of that kind of stature, like, to spend an afternoon hearing that stuff, that was incredible. Nas, getting to be part of an interview with Nas at South by Southwest, talking about Illmatic. I would say definitely the 45 King. That was pretty wild, getting to go to his place and see the phone booth he had and the turnstile he had inside his house, and, getting to talk to him about all of his, all the stuff he's done, and seeing all the memorabilia in his house. The actual Annie record that he sampled Hard Knock Life from is, up framed on the wall. So things like that, those are definitely some highlights. I mean, I could look and come up with dozens more. I'm sure, each interview has its unique things, definitely.
Yeah, I would say another one is your interview with Gabriel Roth.
Yeah.
That
Gabe,
was that you seemed really excited, and it's just so much information that I also learned, especially I would say most importantly, probably the inner workings of of his record label and how he approaches it.
Yeah, that was a very, very unexpected connection, actually, through Josh, through the show's producer. And yeah, it turned out great. I was really happy to be able to talk to him. And you're right, it absolutely was unexpected.
Now, do you ever have any awkward interview moments, and how do you deal with those?
Sure. The Johnny Rotten interview was full of awkward moments. And in fact, when you listen back, it does not, or when I listen back, I do not hear the same tension that I felt during almost the entire conversation. So that was, there were very tense moments on there. I mean, that's kind of his thing, right? It's been his thing for 40 years to be a little difficult. So,
yeah.
I shouldn't be surprised. So yeah, if you listen back, you'll hear some tense moments in there. There was some other stuff, sort of before the interview, nothing too bad, but just, we had a bunch of people in there because a lot of people wanted to meet him and take pictures and stuff. And, so the atmosphere was maybe a little, the room was maybe a little more crowded than he would have liked and things like that. Yeah, I mean, there have definitely been, a handful of moments, what happens more often is someone talks about something and then you get the phone call the next day where they say, oh, hey, I said this, but, and those are always difficult, as are situations where, person A says something and then, you get a call from person B who says, well, that's not how it went down. How could you tell your listeners that? And things like that. I think that happens more than, actual tense interview moments, although those definitely occur as well.
Now, your episodes, the editing is so detailed, the way you drop in clips and have kind of annotations throughout the interview, I guess almost like an audio form of Rap Genius. How much editing and how long does that take? And what's the editing process like for each interview that you do?
That is largely Josh is doing. He and I kind of go back and forth about like who spends more time on each episode, me researching or him editing, and it's probably neck and neck. He is fantastic and extremely detail oriented. We're texting back and forth constantly all day about the smallest minutia of the show that no one will ever hear except us. No one would ever notice. I will go through and listen to the unedited interview and make my initial notes of, hey, I cough here. Hey, it'd be great to put in these 10 seconds of this song over here. And, and kind of give him that as a skeleton. And he will take it from there and turn it into, the end result.
Is there a story behind the opening beat to the Cipher?
Where it's just we use the different poles, the Brand Nubian and Redman and all that.
Actually, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like that as well as the beat that comes in by, is it 57 Ghosts?
42 Ghosts. Yeah, that is.
Ghosts.
I cannot reveal 42 Ghosts' identity. It is top secret, although I do know it.
Okay.
42 Ghosts is a pseudonym for a producer who wishes to remain anonymous, but under the 42 Ghosts name there is other music, so that has been put out under that name, so I encourage you to check that out.
Okay.
But yeah, I met that person and knew that they were a producer, and I was looking for new theme music and approached him or her, and they said great, and sent me a couple of beats, and this was the one to me that was the best, that fit kind of, kept things moving, was interesting, but also not enough to distract you from me narrating over it.
Now, Now, was there a difficulty from making that transition from Outside the Lines to the Cipher at all?
Yeah, I mean, we ended up taking a few weeks off and making some best of shows, making some quick best of shows, and taking some time off to revamp afterwards. A lot of the difficulties were just technical, choosing a new name, getting a logo, switching the name on iTunes, getting a new website, getting all of the sort of social media that goes along with that. So, those are some of the difficulties. Some of the good things about it was it enabled me to make the show closer to what I sort of always envisioned it. Like in my head, I always had this idea for adding song clips and things like that. And for a variety of reasons, when it was Outside the Lines, I couldn't do that. There were time restrictions. I didn't have as good a grasp on fair use issues, all kinds of things. So, but mostly it was kind of a time crunch. And then once we revamped it, it was like, okay, well, I can actually make this a show that I always wanted it to be all along.
And that was a question that I had. Do you ever have any issues with iTunes with the show clips that you have, the music clips?
I do not. Although, hopefully no one at iTunes is listening. No, and I believe strongly that this is fair use. I have never had any issues with any of the artists or people we've had on the show using any of the excerpts. They're all thrilled. Many of them, as if you're regular listeners, I'm sure you know, many of them, in fact, provide me with rare or hard to find or unreleased material to use on the show. Stuff that they made as teenagers or before they blew up, or that's out of print or whatever, or under a different name or anything. We've had plenty of examples of that, of people, handing that to me to to use on the show. But yeah, I believe very strongly that it's fair use. We only use excerpts and they're illustrative. It is in no way a substitute for hearing the full song.
Right.
And going back to to the transition of the podcast, I can only imagine how, I guess, tedious it was, because I imagine that you guys had to re-upload a lot of these episodes, because now we hear if it's something from when it was Outside the Lines, you're listening to an episode of the Cipher before it was the Cipher, and stuff like that. Yeah,
that was, bless his heart, Josh really led the charge on that. There was definitely, had the idea of like doing the intro and then adding it on and negotiating that with, iTunes and Libsyn and, adding it to the MP3, however he did it, and our web guy at that time, Paul, however they negotiated that. It took a long time. We had to do that, several episodes at a time over the course of, several weeks to get it done. Mm-hmm. I mean, long term, in an infinite universe with an infinite amount of time, I would love to go back to all of the first 70 odd episodes and sort of do them in the new format, add song clips and things like that. That is a very labor-intensive process. I don't know if that will happen anytime soon.
And also, what happened? What's going on with Nicole Otero?
Mm-hmm.
Am I saying that? If I'm saying that,
Otero, yeah, she pops up in a couple of the early episodes, as you know, and in fact, I think even does, the interview with Bilal that's somewhere in the archives, and is part of the interview with Nas. She was, when I was at Rap Genius, she was the head of artist relations there. She left shortly before I did. She is out in California doing amazing things with video, working with directors and things like that. And also, last I checked, was doing great work with Blackout for Human Rights, that amazing organization that just put on that huge concert in Flint.
Cool.
Now, I guess when it came time to leave Rap Genius, what was behind that decision, and what was your path next?
Well, there's only so much I can say about that for a variety of complicated reasons, but essentially, a lot of the original editorial team ended up leaving around the same time.
Mhm.
It was just a difference in approach, a difference in focus. Um, I guess, a lot of the things that the company has gone on to do, I think are great, but was not as passionate about as the idea of using this platform to annotate hip hop lyrics.
Mhm.
Mm.
So you've since become a contributor to various publications. You've been published in the Atlantic and Forbes. How did that come about?
So the Atlantic thing happened actually while I was at Rap Genius. One of the ways we built our name was contributing to other outlets. So I had amazing opportunities there to write for all kinds of places. Forbes did come later. Shortly after I left, I had become friends with the man who is now the senior entertainment editor over there. So when I left Genius, I had lunch with him and I said, "Hey, do you think that maybe I could write for you guys?" And he was kind enough to say yes. And I've been, doing that ever since. Maybe, a column a week or so of all sorts of music business related things.
Hmm. And are you involved in any way in the Cash Kings, Hip Hop Cash Kings list?
I have, not in choosing the people,
Mhm.
but yes, in helping to put the package together of the Cash Kings and the new Cash Princes. I have been involved in writing some of the pieces and doing some of the videos that they have to go on with the packages. Yes.
Hmm.
And that was great because it gave me a chance to talk to Birdman, which was wild.
Can you detail that experience?
I pick up the phone and I hear his right-hand man say, "I've got baby on the line for you." And that was something I thought I would never hear. And that was actually really interesting. He was, like you would imagine from hearing other interviews with him, reticent and short answers and not super revealing. But I was lucky in that I was talking to him about, pre 1998, right? What is sometimes called the first generation of Cash Money artists
Mhm.
before their deal with Universal Records. And so he was a little more outgoing, talking about, businesses his dad used to own and, their work with Pen and Pixel and selling records throughout the South. It wasn't like I was asking him, "So Lil Wayne sued you," or something that might, cause him to clam up, with stuff that was far enough in the past that he was, by normal Birdman standards, very forthcoming. So I'm very grateful for that.
Now, speaking, I guess on like a label such as Cash Money, especially during that time, I saw that you said in an interview about how I guess the new internet age kind of eliminates the regional differences in um, hip hop music, and I was wondering, how you feel about that now, and if you still can pinpoint any type of regional sounds that are coming up, or if it's all just one kind of mishmash of people just using different styles.
That's a very good question. I actually just wrote something about this for the Observer.
Mhm.
So if you check it out on observer.com, you can see my long-winded thoughts about this very issue. Uh, Essentially, it seems like there are, things that are recognizable as regional styles, but they are a lot more mixed up.
Mhm.
You will hear a group from Atlanta like Migos using a flow like that triplet flow that is associated with Memphis. You will hear, a rapper from Canada Drake using chopped and screwed styles that are associated with Houston. So it seems like the individual bits of styles are there, but they are mixed up.
Now, what what region of style do you kind of gravitate towards the most?
Well, it depends on my mood. I love bounce. It was obviously from New Orleans. Um, really love that. But there is also so much Houston music that I love. I am not by any means an expert on the sort of chopped and screwed side of things, but the more sort of like Rap a Lot and Zero and K Reno and those people, and Face and whomever I absolutely love.
That's interesting because, especially, coming from the Northeast, I guess, especially when I was coming up, I used to have a bias, and I didn't really listen to too much of that stuff. And then going back when I'm older, I'm like, wow, like there's like a lot of musicianship and a lot of things that I kind of missed, in certain places like Houston and even like some of the early Atlanta music and different places like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I, definitely love, Shy D and all that kind of like early 90s Atlanta based stuff, definitely. And then, obviously where it went after that with the Dungeon family and all their affiliates was incredible. And like you said, very, very musical.
Now, do you still play at all?
I do sometimes, yeah. I actually just did a session, an album with a friend just a few weeks ago. So occasionally, if it's
Stein, right?
yeah. Oh wow, Jesus, look at you, really, really going deep here. Yes, Scott, my friend Scott Stein, who is a wonderful songwriter and pianist. I did an album with him that is forthcoming. I believe he's putting the finishing touches on it right now. So occasionally, yeah, if there are people I've worked with in the past, who ask me, I will do stuff, but, far, far less frequent now than it used to be.
And I see that you've also had speaking engagements at various universities and at the Schomburg. And I was wondering what you usually talk about during your speaking engagements.
It depends. Sometimes they will be themed, different. I've done things that were panels, so obviously there's topics there. The most recent one, which was at the Clive Davis Institute at NYU, Dan Charnas, former guest of the Cipher, asked me to come in and talk about sound-alikes. The records that are, versions of hit songs done by, essentially no-name artists that are meant to sound exactly like the original version. I wrote a long article about that last year for Q Point that Dan edited. And so, he obviously knew I wrote about it, so he asked me in to lecture about that. So I got to talk about that for a while.
Now, I know that Dan is involved in television work. Have you done any television or film work?
I am just starting that now, actually. There is not that much I can say about it, but there is what will hopefully be a documentary series about hip hop that is in its very, very early stages now that I am working on. So I will, as that, pokes its head above water a little more, I would love to come back and talk about it.
Well, that'd be great. We really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I guess, during the Cipher, I noticed that, a lot of other podcasts, they tend to have a lot of like advertisements. And it seems like you are really focused on Patreon. Where do you see like the development of the Cipher and, developing, relationships with advertisers, or do you have any plans for that in the future?
I am certainly not against it. I'm not against money.